Hello everyone. Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much, Fred. Grateful we got there at the end. It's a whole journey how we got here. But sorry, it is the Uncommon Voices podcast about your experiences working with refugee and asylum seekers in the sector in the UK from 2011, from 2016, I believe, October. The purpose of the podcast is to ask you questions directly, understand your role, your work in the last few years, in the next few years to come, in line with your organization vision, strategy, and mission. My name is Adam Yasir. I am the co-host. I do have a cameraman and the editor, Suleiman. I'm not sure if you can do this on the other side. We can do it later. The idea of us having a podcast to resonate and to be a direct platform allows asylum seekers and also amplify their voices without any filtering, without any narrative. It is something we felt is needed in the current climate. There are a lot of voices, narratives from left, right, center, from politicians, organizations, campaigners, humanitarian, lawyers, solicitors, you name them. We felt there is a voice that is needed in the current climate, and that's the subject, and that's the person, that's the human voice, which is to represent asylum seekers and refugees. Hence, we are really kicking this really amazing journey with you guys. I would like you to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your organization, and yeah.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for letting us be part of this. I'm not sure if we're the first, but we are excited to be here on Uncommon and hope to see many more express themselves and have a dialogue with you and Suleiman and the people who are listening. So thanks, guys, also for tuning in. In terms of my background, I'm Fred Kastner. I'm one of the co-founders at Turn, alongside Charlie, who I'll pass on to in a second. My role at Turn nowadays is to help other partners do what we do in other cities, both in the UK and elsewhere, and also to work on innovation. And I get a chance to work with a lot of our alumni as well, which is exciting. So I'll come back to that later. I'll pass over to Charlie.
Great to be here, Adam. I'm Charlie. I'm Fred's co-founder at Turn, and to briefly introduce what Turn does, we are focused on enabling refugees to thrive through the power of their own ideas. We started in 2016 out of a recognition that there were really no supported pathways to self-employment for refugee entrepreneurs, which we felt was a failure of recognition of the ambition of many of the community. And we felt as a founder group that we had access to networks, knowledge, and finance that could help accelerate the progression of the business community within the refugee population. My role now is focused on fundraising and partnerships. So I spend a lot of time speaking to public sector and private sector organizations about how we can level the playing field for this community. I'm excited to speak openly with you today.
Thank you for that intro. I'm going to be asking the question directly due to the time we have,
Yeah,
and also trying to keep it short and sweet, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
First question, what's the purpose of life? Beside that, your organization is to support refugees and migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees. When you mentioned the UK, so let's say we're in London, we'd like to focus on the UK for now. What motivates you to set up as why refugees in terms of the community and whatnot?
So, from us, actually, it started from a very specific recognition. We both had previous experiences in the forced migration sector, but within the UK context, a recognition that the livelihood outcomes for refugees were a lot lower, disproportionately lower than other populations, other migrant populations as well. So there was a lot of research coming out in 2015, 2016 that showed that the refugee community was disproportionately unlikely to be out of work, disproportionately likely to be earning lower incomes, and we felt that that was not reflective of the skill sets that we'd seen in the refugee community through our previous experiences. So for us, it was a very clear challenge. There's something about the experience of claiming asylum that was creating disproportionate livelihood outcomes, and we felt that that was unfair and a problem we wanted to work on.
What I can add to that, personally, I was always excited about solutions where people help themselves, and so I was working with social entrepreneurs from refugee backgrounds in East Africa with UNHCR before starting Turn, and then I met people who had so much potential. They validated that assumption, and it was clear that they could do more if they had the right resources and had perhaps the right allies. And I knew that refugees were everywhere around the world, but I lived in the UK, so I tried to bring that back. I found my co-founders But point being, it's exciting to work on solutions where people create new things themselves, because it's not about what we do, it's about what they can do and putting them in the right spot from which they can go on to do more than you could ever dream of. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And do you reckon, in terms of the right support offers, is it in line with support and empowerment in terms of your social mission and your statements, and why is that the company?
It's in line with self-empowerment.
Self-empowerment.
That is the idea. Of course, that means putting the scaffolding around self-empowerment, so
Right.
to make that easier rather than just a chore and churn. But it's about self-empowerment. That's the goal. So putting people in a place where they create solutions and are supported in doing so, where the value creation by refugees and asylum seekers becomes well known and well supported, not just by niche organizations like ourselves.
Yeah, and I think one of the key words in our mission statement is enable. So our entire focus is on really not treating our community as beneficiaries, but as equal actors in a way that we can leverage our networks and our knowledge to the best of our ability to enable the founders that come out of the refugee community. And if we're successful, they should be at the forefront of our work, not Turn.
Thanks. Equal partners, which is very incredible work, and I'm going to just unpack on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
What does it mean in terms of your organizational structure? Equal partners. Do we understand that refugees and asylum seekers, or refugees specifically, have stakeholders in your shareholders in your organization, decision-making strategies, and sort of forward moving in terms of how they are actually structuring the organization, or are they the terms used loosely here? They are service users in some organizations, which is really not something that we can understand a bit more on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. So we have a formal goal to make Turn 51% refugee-led or more. So 51% intentionally more than half, and then from there on we can grow. We'll see where we get to, and we want to penetrate the entire organization with that. So yes, it starts with participation bottom up, with users becoming alumni trainers that we work with and who start teaching instead of any other staff who don't have lived experience. But not just because they have lived experience, but because they also bring something technical or expertise-wise to the table, so the combination thereof, to enrich what we do and make it better. So we think the result will be better because they will do it, and that has been an ongoing process for the last few years. Now we have over 20 Turn champions who have been trained and who are all Turn alumni. But then it also goes into self-representation. That will be a next layer, where the voices of our campaigns, public advocacy and such have to be led by refugees. This is from scratch is going to be the case, but it's an area we have to strengthen. Maybe Charlie wants to talk about that in a second. And then it winds up to governance. And that is something that we also truly committed to, refreshing our directors board and also having an advisory board that is refugee-led. We've held that back a little bit, the creation of that, because we're preparing for the right setup, so that we don't start with other people first who don't have that background, and so that we find the right talent and are ready. But we have formal targets by the end of 2024 to put the governance change in place. But that's in year 7, so it could certainly have happened faster, but that's where we're at. So we're thinking different layers.
Just to add to that a little bit, we don't have shareholders, but the other way that we're looking to share influence and decision making with the community in turn is also financial power. I mean, that's one of the big aspects of this, is we can create representation, I think, within an organization, equal representation, not just service user representation. I think we're quite well progressed on that. The majority of our interventions now are co-designed and co-led by our community. And we make sure that they're paid for their time. I think that's a really important start point. Paying for expertise from the community is I think, a non-negotiable for organizations like us. The next step up is, how do you write, without shareholders, how do you write the community that you work with into the business model of the organization? And the way that we think about that challenge is through supply chain opportunities. So how much of the capital that we spend on our suppliers can we spend on the community? and we've spent about £150,000 so far. Turn is not a big organisation, but there's still, over time, accumulates quite a lot of spend that we can actually put back into the community. So now about 40% of our overhead spend is spent on our community. So that's one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it is, as we start to build up staff spend and leadership spend, making sure that we can bring in representation into our staff costs as well. So that's an important aspect of it.
Small details also, thanks Charlie for mentioning paying them, it's also paying them well,
Yeah.
and recognizing their value add. So our starting per hour contracts for our alumni champions is £20 an hour, and it goes up to £25 an hour at the moment, depending on the responsibilities. So that's £6 above the real living wage in London. At least that's a reference point. It certainly could be higher in some cases in the future as well, for leadership positions and such. But yeah, we do want to.
And we would love to start a conversation. Sorry, I know we're taking our time.
No.
We'd love to start a conversation with the wider sector on being more transparent about fair pay to the community. I think the sector in general is not progressed on this conversation.
Certainly, I think that's thank you. The question which is linked to the previous question I asked is when you mention fair pay, and it's really admirable, commendable, I must say. Organization pay community members, organization bear their names and set up as such. I wonder, there are people from the community arguing that if you actually hire someone on a 4 months, 2 months, 1 month contract based on, and what next for them to go on a 0-hour contract in completely different sector where their experience and obviously credential competency is not being utilized, people may think there are element of perhaps gatekeeping an organization that's structured, let's say yours, been about 6-7 years, yet to have a director from lived experience, and that's quite a long time given there is progressive element development and enhancement. And I think got about 10 staff members, if I'm not right, and 5 directors, and according to your organizational structure, 5 directors on from Global South, let alone from refugees. And perhaps that's something I really like to kind of the audience and myself need to know a bit more about it, because good to talk about fair pay on a short term, but strategically people felt there is element of tokenism where organizations are utilizing the aspect of, yes, we have someone from the lived experience, but they aren't really impactful in any decision given in terms of like strategic level, and they haven't got a lot of say. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it's a fair question for sure.
If you don't mind,
Yeah,
I'll
you go.
So, great questions. We ask ourselves the same question, and actually since the beginning, I will start briefly with the staffing element. So I think the best thing would be to speak directly to the Turn champions and think of whether they feel they have an empowered position or not. So let them speak for themselves. And so I would love for you to have the chance to speak to them on that basis. I think I won't put words in their mouth, so let's see what they have to say. I'd love to add those voices to this episode if it's possible. To
Absolutely.
Some follow-up, so that would be great. Secondly, the last 2 hires have been lived experience leaders who, so the full-time hires. So not only do we have contracted talent, but we also have full-time talent, and that's only going to increase. We have had other full-time employees in the past with lived experience, but it should increase in percentage. So you could hope that if Turn was to grow double the size in full-time staff members, that eventually 51% would be from lived experience backgrounds. So like the same principle applies here. But Turn doesn't necessarily want to grow its full-time staff base. This is a strategic decision. We can discuss that another time why. The specialized contractor base is really important for us. So that's an organizational model. But refreshing our staff that we already have, if people leave, with lived experience leaders would definitely be a key priority. And new staff positions full-time also being positioned like that. When it comes to directors, there's both the history of where we started and then also what we're doing next. Both are important. Totally true. We had 5 directors, I believe now we have 4. So we're in the process of deconstructing the directors board slowly but surely, formally, as in terms of discontinuing very lovely people who are very committed to the cause, so that they now start making room for the new directorial hires. And like we said earlier, we have the goal to refresh that by the end of 2024. Whether we will already achieve a like-for-like 2 directors with that background by the end of 2024, whether we, 6 months later we will have achieved that goal, we shall see. Sometimes 6 months more might give you the right time to get the right person in, which is important as well. But that's a firm goal. We've also made some formal commitments to that. So 2 specific funders, for example, were also on board with this change and want to see this change happen as well, so they believe in that. I will say one thing. I'm not ashamed for the 7 years without it, only for one reason, because when we started, we didn't know too many people from the background ourselves, but we were looking for co-founders. I was looking actively for co-founders from the background in 2015, but I didn't meet somebody who wanted to start the social enterprise with me. I did find Charlie and some of his family members at the time and another colleague who had been working with me on projects, and they did have a progressive mindset. So at least that was a good starting point, and I never regret starting the work, and they've worked extremely hard over the 7 years. But they know, and we know, when the time has come, and it could have come faster, but we also had to grow the organization and want to holistically develop it. So I'll never be ashamed for having started with what we had, even though we could have kept working at the beginning even harder to find such leaders, but our networks in the community honestly weren't strong enough, because my work and their work was outside of the UK when it came to lived experience leaders. So I had a lot of such people in Uganda, but I couldn't get them over here for obvious reasons, because they were refugees there. But they would have been the first people I would have co-founded this with. In fact, they were the inspiration for Turn, but there were some practicalities. It's not an excuse for the slowness of it, but we've had our fair share of challenges along the way, but our commitment has never wavered, and our intention to do this was really there from the beginning. But the formalization of it as a formal target, that we've developed in the last year, and now we're hoping to make real progress against that. So I'm not making excuses, but I'm not ashamed of the delay. I just think it could have been better, if that makes sense.
I'm just going to say, just to be clear,
Yeah.
the question objectively being asked, not to shame you, absolutely not.
No, I know, but I'm just saying that in terms of self-reflection, it's absolutely not coming from you. It's more like I've thought about it a lot, and I wish it was faster. Yeah, exactly. I wish it was faster, but it's now happening. So I'm glad that is happening. I do think important. Of course, I would inspire others to do it faster than us. I hope. It's a bit hypocritical to ask that of others, but all I can say is
why do you think others, sorry to interrupt, why do you think others aren't doing it faster? And I think it's also saying about what's wrong with a group of predominantly white people who have, as you mentioned, good intention twice at heart, and represent refugees. What would you say to that statement? What's wrong with that?
Well, self-representation is always the right thing, right? So we need to work hard and challenge ourselves to change the status quo. And even if we can be part of a supportive ecosystem where people are fully self-representing, so we don't have to stop working on this cause just because there is a higher form, a better form of self-representation and leadership. So we can be contributors and add value, because we're here because we want to help, right? That's why we do this instead of something else. But we need to challenge ourselves to achieve higher forms of being and doing, and that is self-representation. It's the only way. It's the only right way. But sometimes organizations are stuck in the realities of running a startup, co-founding, and churning it out, and the speed to the right way isn't always a given if you don't have the right people around you at the very start, as in addition to contributors who come from a background that isn't representative, So I think co-founding is actually a great thing, ideally with the community from the start,
Yeah, I mean, maybe what I would just add to that is, I think a large part of it is about where power sits in decision making, and maybe just to add a little bit of additional context for our situation, which is in our directors team we only have 2 paid directors, and so one of the, I think, challenges in how we create representation in leadership within the refugee sector is there's a lot of leadership in the refugee sector which is voluntary. So through trustee boards, through director positions that are unpaid, and a lot of the community that we work with is low income. So you have to square quite a difficult circle, which is you want to make sure that leadership, especially leadership when it's coming from low income communities, is paid and paid fairly. But a lot of the non-profit sector relies on leadership that is unpaid, and that's a sector-wide challenge, and that creates privilege at the top of senior leadership in the non-profit sector. And so I think the challenge for a sector like the refugee sector or the forced migration sector in the UK is how do you build budget to pay leadership from lived experience communities on a model that has previously been reliant on unpaid expertise. And that's the challenge that we have to solve at Turn. One of the reasons why it's been easier for us to build in representation in delivery models is because the affordability for our organisations is more accessible at that level, right? So we want to be able to pay a director when we bring them on for their expertise at a higher salary level than a facilitator, for example. And that requires us to be able to change our fundraising model to do that to a degree.
Speaking of finance, that's the point before my third question to last.
Yeah.
You had recently became a supplier to a contract by the Home Office to rescue, I believe, which is tackles employment and housing for refugees, so a £7 million contract. I would want to inquire a bit more on your role on how do you feel now that as an organization structured by a few, if I may say, family members, expanded to bring other people from the lived experience and intended to do so by 2024. Finance wouldn't be an issue at this stage, given there is a whole element of people aren't really in this stage because they really feel like they want to contribute, and there is an element of privilege, as you mentioned, there. So I guess given the recent contract that you do have with it seems very reasonable. Finance is not an issue where you could sort of have at least multiple co-shared directors role.
Just on that contract.
It's important to be specific which proportion of that contract
so
we have.
our part of that contract is only £80,000.
Right.
So it's a very small subset of the wider IRC contract. So unfortunately we're not massively financially empowered by that specific contract. But our revenue is growing, and that does create space. That's why we think we can do it on a 2024 timeline. Previously, our directors' salaries were we only had 2 paid directors and at a very low level. Transparently, we had to give up a lot of financial risk at the start. And that's one of the things we always say is, we think it would have been very difficult for lived experience leaders to start Turn, because we went unpaid for 2 years at the start, and you can't afford to take that kind of risk without privilege. I mean, that is the reality. And we have to call it out and say, there is something wrong with the system if the only people that can start organisations like Turn at the moment are people who can take on that type of financial risk. Now, 7 years in, we have a more financial ability to make sure that somebody coming on as a co-director doesn't need to take on that risk. But it's taken us 7 years to get to that kind of financial power. And that's a challenge. And one of the things that Turn wants to solve is, and hopefully we are solving it, is allowing other social entrepreneurs who want to start organisations like Turn, focused on the empowerment of the community, in a way that means that they don't have to work for 2 years for free at the start. That's the systemic change that we want to create.
I do value your openness and also keen on collaborative for a cloud organization, and I felt the market is slightly, and I don't like to call it a market because it implies product, implies inhumane element to it. But for what it is, it's a business model you have, and it's working great. I felt just sort of understand a bit more on your mission statement by, you said, the end of 2024. Lived experiences as a pledge you made. Is that something part of a greater other collectively organization in the sector you guys had sat down and said, well, we have to make 51% of our staff directors, or is it so?
That was something we made up.
Yes, now.
No, 3 years ago. So as you can see, it kind of incrementally was implemented, and the clarity emerged over time through planning and meeting also interesting people who could fulfill the role. Honestly, we have more prospects for the director's role than we need, but the problem is they're all entrepreneurs.
Right.
And they all want to keep running their enterprise, or they have very high talent and they're in demand.
Fred,
and so
not all in London, I must say. You are in London.
yeah, but some of them are like, they're really excellent people. Like over the last 7 years, we've met so many amazing alumni, or sometimes people who were already running their own business. And it's like, it would be hard to choose. It will be hard to choose. The question is, will they want it?
Yeah.
Because and how much of it will they want, you know? So this is an interesting challenge. But coming back to your question, we're part of several networks. Charlie, I'm sure you'll cover that, where multiple, in particular, livelihood-centric organizations in the refugee sector are working together. So I'm sure Charlie knows more about that than I in terms of what standards are being communicated. I think advocacy in such networks would be a good start to then implement such standards. We're already sharing, but maybe not yet enough, especially when we've implemented it by the end of 2024. We should switch gear and talk to people and say, hey, this is what we're doing, what are you doing? We also know a few organizations, or representatives of the community like yourself, who are already advocating on the subject. There's also an alumni, Yusuf Shifti, who founded Experts by Experience, trying to place lived experience leaders across the sector, which is fantastic. So we need to work with those kinds of parties. If we can then also influence, say, government, social impact investors to make refugee representation part of their procurement criteria, then this will create another pressure point, and then it will be bi-directional, bottom up, change from a network of organizations who buy into some common standards, and then also the procurement needs. This is something we can do. It's been demonstrated by, for example, Black empowerment organizations in the US who have pushed funders to be like that, and now funders require it from new projects, which is great. It's this bi-directional influence that we should emulate and imitate here in the UK, and hopefully due to then mastering that over the next few years, together with others, we could also pass that on to our international partners who we're training in case they haven't done that themselves in other countries who do the kind of work we do.
Yeah,
Certainly, I think, yeah, thanks. Oh, sorry.
No, all I would add to that is I would be interested in your reflections on this as well, because my impression is that it is changing, that there is a recognition within the refugee sector that lived experience representation is crucial. Certainly funders, the more progressive funders are making this argument, as Fred said, bi-directionally. Yusuf is now the first head of lived experience at Refugee Council, so one of the leading players is now creating space for this in a new way. And for us, we want to first create good practice within our own organisation. I think the commitment to being 51% refugee-led sets a new benchmark, potentially, for the sector to follow in, but we've got to deliver on it first, and then we can talk about it more openly about how we can achieve it. The only other thing I think I would say in terms of progress towards that goal is I think a lot of the sector is very small. So you've got to create change in the sort of 5 to 6 players who are above a certain size. The question then becomes, how do you get representation? 80% of the sector is under 5 employees in the refugee sector. So how do you create representation in the wider civil service and civil society around the refugee community, which is a very large space, 500 plus organisations work in refugee inclusion in the UK. I think first we have to hold the biggest organisations accountable, and then we have to start thinking about how we get change at a local level, and that's going to be interesting.
Certainly.
Just one quick point on that. One thing we are trying to do is to literally help launch refugee-led social enterprises, and we incubate 25 in the UK per annum at the moment. So we have a dedicated incubator for social enterprises called Ideas into Action in collaboration with a few partners, and we incubate 25 refugee-led social enterprises or non-profits. Of those, I would say 70% plus address the needs of refugees and asylum seekers, and maybe others, but certainly have that target group. But we also have to help them grow beyond the 5. Often it's 1 to 2 people operation at the beginning for a few years until maybe some of them grow. So, they themselves are directly, led by refugees, of course.
Certainly, and now I do have. Again, I really felt, and I did say earlier, you first in our podcast about employment aspect and empowerment aspect of this journey.
And Adam, do you mind if I ask quickly? Do you feel like it's lived experience representation in the refugee sector is changing?
Statistically, not. There are changes in, let's say, project coordinator's role and things to do with the 3 months, 4 months contract. The reality of people actually at the front page on a level where organizations there, and then you've got someone from lived experience there, was great. Edited heavily, sort of like amazing picture, but beyond that, that person isn't, or the people actually in that press release aren't really at the front seat or even the side. Rather, sort of, and I did mention this earlier, and I felt from my lived experience and from the organization that I work with in the borough, in Croydon, South London Borough, part of the Home Office. There's one step forward and 2 steps backwards, and it's a challenge. And I think part of it relies on unlearning, challenging our own sort of prejudice, and also ensuring there is accountability. People actually preaching on inclusivity and representation need to be asked questions about, are you actually representative enough in your organization? They aren't being asked, and I think from a lot of the people who actually came through the journey of being a refugee, finding peace, and want to settle and restart your life or start your life here, people aren't really keen on sort of going back to say, actually, I've had some help from your organization in next year, and I'd like to now ask you, how come you haven't had someone from that experience? People aren't being asked to question.
Yeah.
From my own experience, being asked to be grateful, being asked to thank those who actually saved me, and that's the thing I felt having a front dialogue with you guys to unpack a lot of the stigma, a lot of the issues where people shy away from, like we're humanitarian, great, hey, we need to do better. Particularly the UK, particularly the current climate, and I would like to sort of ask you one last question in relation to that.
Yeah.
What's the difference between empowerment and support?
Good question.
I promise there's no caution there. From your perspective, it doesn't have to be a textbook. It's more like what you think.
Authenticity, depth, sustainability, ethics, truth. I mean, all those things matter in the differentiation. Obviously, empowerment is all of those things. And there's something after empowerment as well, where the empowered and their holding of power should become a new norm rather than a constant process that has to be at least repeated as a whole all the time, regenerating that power level all the time. So we want to also have a systemic element to empowerment rather than just a micro element, or in other words, a macro element to it. And it is what changes the status quo for the next generation. It is a voice at the table. It is across different layers of society, public governance, government, local government, social impact finance, impact delivery organizations, and penetrating it. Support does none of those things. It's not just a band-aid. I don't want to disrespect people who put emphasis on support, and we do support as well, of course, but it can never be as effective as it could be, or as lasting as it could be without empowerment. In a way, I always thought social enterprises in some ways should make themselves obsolete over time, but it could take a long time for one social enterprise to do that in one specific cause. Because if empowerment works, it should change this equator so much that public institutions and the general mainstream ecosystem should be so participative at one point that social enterprises could fade out. Why not? Unless the community really wants to keep it going and it's an opportunity. That's okay, if it still can create value, but for me that's the difference. Non-patronizing.
Yeah, I would sort of summarize what Fred just said is the difference is it's structural, right? So Support looks to solve a specific challenge. And I think empowerment looks at the structure within which that challenge takes place and says, how can we change that structure? And one of the things we've seen across our time at Turn is that the more that we work with this community, the more that we see the structural barriers that are holding back the livelihoods of this community. And that comes and starts from access to knowledge, which is where Turn started, but it bleeds into access to customers. You know, how do you actually build up your customer base when you're more isolated than other communities? And then it, perhaps even more foundationally, bleeds into access to finance. The structural barriers that prevent people from competing fairly for finance, that create unfair outcomes for this community. And in each of those areas, we've ended up needing to create bespoke solutions for the community to counter those structural challenges.
And that's a training you flagged it out earlier.
Training, but it was also, we started a marketplace specifically for refugee-led brands to try and create specific pathways to access to customers. And we started a microfund specifically for refugee founders, because we think that actually what you need is to recognize that the mainstream structures are biased. So we need to create our own solutions to level the playing field and drive structural change. I think that's what empowerment means.
That's your commitment you made. On that note, I'm really, really grateful to you guys. It has been uncommon voices I've heard. I'm extremely enlightened by your being upfront and honest, and I think that is something I'm taking on, having to speak to or intend to speak to your colleagues from the lived experience in the next episode.
Absolutely.
With you guys.
Yeah, happy to
Pleasure.
do
Yeah,
that.
real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks,
for
Adam.
the man.
Keep
Thank
on
you.
challenging us.
Yeah.